sustainable surfboards is a pretty cool story. And before long, people realized, hey, wait a minute, this isn't bad for the environment. The boards actually work great. Epoxy is actually more durable, it'll last longer. Whereas before, the narrative was always, why would I do it? What's the drawback? What's the extra cost? And then suddenly it became, why wouldn't I do it?
Welcome to Insiders, B2B intelligence for those serious about surf parks. Hello and welcome to Insiders. Today I'm quite jazzed to be having a conversation with one of the more interesting climate surf nerds you could hope to meet. Kevin Wilden is co-founder of the non-profit Sustainable Surf. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good, thank you. Maybe we could get started today, Kevin, with the elevator pitch on what Sustainable Surf is and what it aims to do.
For sure. So Sustainable Surf is a nonprofit. We were founded in 2011. We're based in California. And Michael Stewart and I, we saw an opportunity for surfers to really take a lead on sustainability. And we were actually kind of put off by how surf culture was not really very active in sustainability. Back in, this is like the late 2000s, 2010, you could see all the other outdoor sports were really moving forward on sustainable practices, better products. Patagonia was really at their heyday, and surfing was just totally behind. And so we thought we'd start a nonprofit that could actually help change that narrative and create action pathways, essentially hack the system and establish a vision of what it means for surfers to take care of the ocean and help solve climate change.
Right on. So before we get too far down the path and start talking about all the different programs that Sustainable Surf has put into place to achieve this aim of changing the narrative around surfing to something that's more embracing of sustainability, I know that you've got some pretty interesting academic credentials and you've had some pretty fascinating research adventures. I wonder if you could just tell us a couple of stories about your academic background, the places you went and the things that you studied.
Yeah, so I actually got into climate change as a geologist. I was studying geology and physics at UC San Diego in the early 90s. I was kind of blown away by the idea of climate change and how humans had completely changed the climate system in which we live and potentially cause a mass extinction on the planet. And that really inspired me to think more about how to work on that problem. So I went to grad school to study permafrost in Antarctica at the University of Washington. And I went to Antarctica to do research on permafrost, on polygonal pattern ground, and how essentially how what's happening in the poles like Antarctica and the Arctic really are the key drivers to understanding how climate systems change. And from there, I started working in carbon offset policy. Like in the year 2000, I was working for one of two firms in the US that actually knew what a carbon offset was and developed them. And from there, that was really early days. And it's just been if you call me a climate nerd, I've been trying to figure out various ways to solve climate change my entire career. I went from that to doing renewable energy and energy efficiency development. I spent a few years working for a clean tech firm that was doing carbon sequestration in the ocean in the mid 2000s. And in the late 2000s, when we're about to start Sustainable Surf, I was just like kind of demoralized actually by how little progress we were making on the problem. We continue still to make very little progress. And I realized the real thing that needed to change was the story. We had to have a better story about how to solve these problems. And that's about the time I learned how to surf. And I realized the power of surfing has to tell stories. Like there's like the joke that we make is that the best way to make any product look good and sell is to put a surfer next to any product. And academics use that not academics, marketers use that all the time to sell whatever, right? So couldn't we use that power for good to really, get this idea of sustainability far more appealing and engaging to the average person? And it's also 100% authentic to surfing. So there's sort of that narrative arc of going from hardcore climate science, seeing what it takes to do like really quality carbon offsets and watching this market develop over the decades that led me to where I'm at now.
Thanks for that background. That's kind of fascinating. How long were you in Antarctica for?
So I was there for one season and flew down from Christchurch down to McMurdo Sound in the US base there. And then from there, we took helicopters into the dry valleys of Antarctica, which is the driest, coldest place on Earth. Hasn't rained there in millions of years. Yeah.
Wow. that's kind of cool. Well, and I appreciate the backstory as well, and the frustrations moving into the 21st century with trying to get the story about climate change to break through. And so our paths crossed about a year after you formed Sustainable Surf in 2011. You were looking for a platform to get the word out about the organisation, and I was putting on a conference on sustainability and philanthropy in surfing. You guys came in last minute. I think you had the EcoBoard project up and running. And I remember you gave a talk that blew everyone's minds with the possibilities of circularity in the use of expanded polystyrene as a surfboard blank that could be endlessly recycled. I wonder if you could share your recollections of that time from those early days, where sustainable surf was headed and what kind of headwinds you were facing from the industry, which I think were kind of significant in the early days.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time. Like we basically started a nonprofit with a $10,000 loan to start the company, and we had to basically bring in all of our revenue to pay our salaries from the start. We didn't have big philanthropists funding us. We just wanted to do this so bad. And part of it is that we saw the opportunity with surfboards to help transform how surfboards are made to have sustainability be part of the story again. Keep in mind the original surfboards from ancient Hawaii were about as sustainable as you could possibly get. And then there was this transition to fossil fuels and aerospace technology that has a really high footprint. Polyurethane foam and resin actually have quite a big footprint. But we saw that there are some innovators in the space. One of them was Marco Foam, who was making a recycled EPS blank. Now, recycled EPS can be recycled indefinitely. It's a material that is very strong. You can actually recycle it indefinitely. So, could recycled EPS blanks make a surfboard that then get recycled when that surfboard breaks? That was the idea, and we were actually helping them do that. We helped them, make surfboards that were more sustainable. And we saw, and basically, in terms of the headwinds at that time, what we saw was that there had been a few materials that came out a few years before around like a recycled polyurethane foam and whatnot that were pretty much greenwashing. They weren't very authentic. Plus, they didn't really work very well to make surfboards. And so every shaper that we talked to at that point was like, "Oh yeah, sustainability never works. Boards come out terrible. I don't make boards that rip. I don't want to make boards that'll break, and nobody wants to buy them." So how do we change that narrative? Like, how do we actually shift the market in a positive dynamic? That's what we tried to set out to do.
What was needed to establish this vision that made sense for surfers and for surf companies to follow? You talked about changing the narrative from sustainable products in surfboards that weren't particularly working. What what changed and what drove that to the point where demand for sustainable products in the surf industry started to be seen and the market started to respond?
Yeah, so it's a combination of a few things. One is the materials actually had to work. So the very first two sustainable materials that we certified with our program was the Marco Foam recycled EPS, which basically shaped just as well as standard EPS, maybe slight differences, but nothing any shaper couldn't handle. And then Entropy Resins, Ray and Desi Benatow developed the first bioepoxy resin. And that was just starting to turn clear. It was quite yellow at first, so very niche. But right about that time, around 2012, they were figuring out how to make it clear because no one wants to buy a new surfboard that's already yellow. So the combination of those things, two things meant you could make an epoxy board that was really high quality in terms of both performance and looks. So that was number one. Like you can't do sustainable surfboards that have drawbacks in performance and quality. Once that was done, we saw the opportunity to actually create the transformation campaign. So that was working with, leading manufacturers like Channel Islands and Firewire, and Timmy Patterson was like the first shaper that worked with us to make boards for pro surfers out of these materials to test and try it. And you know what? They ripped. And they made the videos about them, and their brand sponsors of these pro surfers wanted to tell the story. And suddenly, sustainability story was about surfboards actually work really good and they're better for the ocean. And from there, we got media talking about us. So we actually were on national news at one point, on National Geographic and Forbes magazine, and many others started to cover the story because you know what? Sustainable surfboards is a pretty cool story. And before long, people realized, hey, wait a minute, this isn't bad for the environment. The boards actually work great. Epoxy is actually more durable. It'll last longer. Why wouldn't I do it? Whereas before, the narrative was always, why would I do it? Like, what's the drawback? What's the extra cost? So, and then suddenly it became, why wouldn't I do it?
It's a neat way to flip things on its head. And we were watching the development of entropy resins from something that, as you say, was kind of niche to start with, and then ultimately became a really high performing resin that people wanted to use. So we saw that change in the marketplace.
There's a couple of interesting stories I can tell on that. So I had a conversation with Mark Price at Firewire, and they were already on epoxy from the beginning, and they were like, yeah, of course, if it works and it's clear, like, we definitely want to do it. And they eventually invested in Entropy, started producing Entropy at their factory in Thailand. So every single one of their boards is now made of Entropy. And then I was talking to at a conversation actually at that conference in Scripps. I think you were probably there, with Aaron Smith, who's the production manager at Channel Islands, and Rob Machado. And they're like, yeah, the bioepoxy works great. Like, why wouldn't we use it? Like, we should always make all of our epoxy boards with bioepoxy. And I can tell you, like 2 years before that, that never was the conversation. It's like, oh my gosh, sustainability, like that stuff's terrible. I don't want to use that. And suddenly it's like, it's a non-issue. And it should be a non-issue. Like, that's the whole point. It's not like this sacrifice you have to make. That's the narrative around solving climate change too. Like, what's the sacrifice? Really about what's the benefit? Like, why wouldn't I want to have a livable planet for my kids and future generations?
Yeah. Some of the research that I've done suggests that there is significant unmet demand for sustainability in the surf industry and as well as in surf travel. And, if I might, I'll point out some of these statistics because we did a survey of almost 2,200 surfers from around the world. Some of this analysis I presented in a previous episode of Insiders with Dr. Leon Muck. That episode was focused on establishing a demand-side valuation for global tourism. And that being the case, some of the detail was lost when it came to the data of sustainability attitudes among the global surfer population. So here's a bit of the detail that was missing, which I think makes the case that if you can make products that are sustainable or experiences that are sustainable as good or better at the same cost as unsustainable products or experiences, then people are going to gravitate to the ones that are better for the ocean, better for the environment. So we found that only 40% of surfers think the surf industry provides sufficient support to environmental and humanitarian non-profits working in surfing locations. Only 29% think the industry is doing enough to ensure its products are sustainable. Less than 5% of people said they would not choose a sustainable product over one that is less sustainable. 75% said they paid 10% more for a sustainable surf product. 98% would buy a sustainable surfboard if it cost and performance were comparable between the two. Less than 2% say they're not concerned about sustainability in surf tourism destinations. 95% think surf travel businesses should take some responsibility for protecting the environment where they operate. 93% think surf travel businesses should take some responsibility for supporting local communities. 91% think surf travel businesses should be undertaking sustainability initiatives. 83% of people try to be sustainable surf travellers. More than 40% researched the sustainability of their surf travel previously. 71% say they'll do it in the future. And 69% say that will influence their choice of surf tourism in the future. 91% would choose a sustainable business over a non-sustainable surf travel business if price and amenities are comparable, and 75% say they'd pay at least 10% more for demonstrably sustainable surf tourism. So, that kind of speaks for itself. I presented some of this data at the UN Oceans Conference recently, and it opened some eyes about this is unmet demand in the market. If we can get products and experiences that match, that are sustainable, people want those. So you've had first-hand experience in creating and responding to demand for sustainability in surf culture. Can you maybe tell us a little more about the EcoBoard project? You've given us the origins. I'm wondering what kind of impact you've had with that project from its beginnings in 2011 till today.
Yeah, so the way we measure it is the number of ecoboards produced. And again, we define an ecoboard as made with either the sustainable materials that we verified. So at first it was Marco foam and Entropy resin. But before long, there's now 20 different manufacturers that make sustainable materials, both resins and foams that we've worked with, and there's more coming since then. And one of the core things we did was build a process by which Sustainable Surf can verify the supply chains and the data and get test data and measurements of the material manufacturers to ensure they are sustainable. So shapers had an easy job. They just go to our website and find out which materials we verified, and then they just got to find those wherever they happen. And going from just 2 to 20 makes it a lot easier. So then we measure the number of boards made with that, or the number of wooden boards, because a wooden board pretty much consider a more sustainable surfboard. And in 2011, there were maybe 500 to 1,000 of those boards made. Going to this past year, 2021, there were 73,000 eco boards made around the world. That's probably in the range of 10% of surfboard production. So I think that's a pretty significant jump. And we essentially helped create that happen, but it wasn't. We don't make the boards. We just make the vision and the standards, and then it's up to all the shapers and the surfboard buyers to figure out how to do it. And there's been a tremendous amount of innovation that we've seen once essentially this baseline came in. What we do is a baseline. Now, in 2016, we launched Gold Level, which is basically a much more advanced way to make a sustainable board. We actually worked with Channel Islands and Firewire to do a detailed life cycle study of their surfboards. So we had them measure production of a board, all the materials going into the board, all the waste resin, waste foam, everything, energy use. And from that, we're able to show that there's some pretty stunning numbers on the impact of a surfboard. So a typical poly surfboard weighs about 6 pounds. It emits 100 pounds of CO2. So, think about how much weight that would be in carbon emissions. And a big part of that was actually the waste. So the way polyboards were made was using polyester resin, which is fairly cheap, but the labor to make it is more expensive. So the surfboard builder would just slap the resin on as quick as they can and move on to the next board. And so there was 80% waste in polyester resin, the way boards are typically made. And overall, a typical surfboard, if it weighs 6 pounds, would produce around 12 pounds of waste during its production. So it takes 18 total pounds of material, and only 6 pounds of that actually is in the finished product, which is kind of stunning, actually. So we launched Gold Level as a way to reduce waste. Now, eco boards already use less waste. People are much more careful with epoxy resin, which is more expensive. But even so, a blank typically has 40% of the blank just lost when you cut it. So there are ways to actually reduce waste, and the Gold Level designation was about reducing waste and using more advanced sustainable materials. Through those two ideas, we actually gave a platform for the true innovators in surfboard construction to find a way to do it. And occasionally, someone would have a good idea that they thought was going to really save carbon footprint and be good for the environment. And it turns out that when we did the math on the life cycle carbon footprint, it didn't. Actually, it was worse. And
Right.
we were happy to share with our partners so that they would have a better way to understand what they could do that was better.
I mean, this is an example of the surf industry beginning to catch up a little. And I think we see more indicators of that in different parts of the industry. For example, my company Stoke helped the World Surf League become the world's first carbon neutral sports league a few years ago. 12 surf parks have become Stoke members since the release of the Stoke Surf Park Standard just a couple of months ago. More and more surf resorts and surf parks are running on renewable energy and offsetting any additional carbon emissions, at least for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. But offsetting your carbon emissions just isn't enough anymore, is it? Can you explain why we need to go way beyond carbon offsets and what kind of solutions we need to decarbonize the atmosphere and the oceans?
Yeah, so carbon offsets are what I call the tail that wags the dog of solving climate change right now. There's so much focus on carbon offsets, and there's a lot of money and investment in it. They're really hard to get good quality ones now. Last year, they basically all got bought up, whereas they were really having a hard time selling credits. Suddenly, they're all gone. And that's due to net zero and this framework of basically putting carbon offsets on par with carbon emissions reductions, which is always the first thing that people talked about doing in carbon policy. But recognizing that we haven't reduced emissions means that we're now in a state of planetary emergency, where if we somehow, suppose I just clap my hands and suddenly all carbon emissions stopped forever for all time around the world, that wouldn't stop the state of climate change because we've already kicked off melting permafrost, burning rainforests, slowing ocean circulation. The carbon cycle is already emitting more carbon than we actually emit ourselves. So that means we've crossed a tipping point essentially in the carbon cycle. Now it's not too late to walk back and go into the point of climate stability again. The way to do that is to remove CO2 from the atmosphere as fast as we can, while we also reduce emissions as fast as we can. So that means that carbon offsets are essentially now a key part of the solution, especially ones that reduce carbon emissions from the atmosphere, actually take CO2 out of the sequester.
Very serious situation. What do we do about it? And what can, I guess more generally, but keeping in mind that we're talking to a surf park audience here and we can drill more down into things that would work in that industry as we go. But what can we do that actually makes a difference?
There's two ways to answer this. The simple way is, okay, you got to measure your carbon footprint. Everyone has a footprint, right? And then do something about it by reducing emissions and also buying offsets to go, it's called net zero. But that's standard practice, and it's actually not that hard to measure a footprint. And that's what you guys do for surf parks at Stoke. And Sustainable Surf does a lot of that as well. Like we help companies go what we call ocean positive by measuring their footprint and then letting them or having them buy our carbon offset product called a Seatrees token, which also supports blue carbon offset projects and takes out more CO2 than they emit. So and I'd like to talk more about that in a minute, but that's sort of like the basics, but that doesn't solve the actual problem that we have, which is about the story around climate change, how people and humans relate to this planet. We're all part of the carbon cycle. Every single one of us is carbon-based life, and we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Those carbon atoms that we breathe out came from the carbohydrates, the food that we eat, which were produced by the plants that breathe in CO2 and through photosynthesis breathe out oxygen that we then breathe, and they produce food that we then eat. So it's a circularity of the carbon cycle that's running throughout the planet. And it's actually, it tends to be very stable, but it has these instability points, which we've not triggered. And when that happens, really bad things happen. So the problem that we really have, the fundamental problem of solving climate change starts with the story. Jess, you and I both have young children. We know how important stories are. Like literally, the worldview of who we are as a person starts at a very early age. And in recent times, and remember, I'm a geologist, so that means 150 years ago at the start of the Industrial Revolution, we started emitting fossil fuels, which then disrupted the carbon cycle. So what we have to do is figure out how, as a species, we replicate what used to happen in ancient cultures, which was people who lived in a landscape or an area were stewards of that landscape to help it thrive for the benefit of all things, not just themselves. Everything that lived there, they helped. Ancient Hawaii is a great example of that, where they had one of the most sustainable societies in the history of humanity. And surfing still existed then, and it's still a link now between that ancient wisdom and modern times. So basically, it started with a story, and that's why we started our Seatrees program, which I'd love to talk more about as well.
To me, this is a great point to pivot there, because you're talking about a story and the importance of stories, and that they can break through and change the narrative. And Seatrees, as far as I can tell, is blowing up and breaking through. Everywhere I look, and almost every day, I'm seeing new partnerships announced, more compelling content about Seatrees through really large surfing and mainstream media channels. And I'm genuinely really excited about how this is going and where it's going. So talk to me about Seatrees and where we're at.
Yes, indeed. So the idea that we launched in 2019 at actually 2018 at the Global Wave Conference in Santa Cruz. And the program officially was launched in World Oceans Day 2019. And the idea of Seatrees is to restore blue carbon ecosystems. So when it comes to, remember the story I told about the carbon cycle being out of stability and cross a tipping point? What we need in this story is, what if there's a superhero that's going to come and actually put the Earth back in balance? Okay, like superheroes are great at solving problems. Why can't they solve climate change? Turns out the superhero already exists. It's called the ocean. The ocean is where 90% of all the carbon in the carbon cycle is located. Only 2% of the carbon in the carbon cycle is in the atmosphere. So if the problem right now is that there's too much carbon in the atmosphere, where is the likely place to put it? It's the ocean. That's what nature has always done. When there's a large amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the ocean primarily absorbs most of it. And it actually does a lot else. It also regulates temperature and climate now. Like if the ocean didn't exist, from the amount of CO2 we've emitted today, the Earth would be 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Unbelievable, right? So how do we activate the ocean's superpower, which is carbon sequestration? That's called blue carbon ecosystems. Blue carbon is mangrove forests, kelp forests, coral reefs, seagrass beds, even coastal watersheds. They're basically the intersection of land and ocean where plants are incredibly productive at taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ocean. So we launched Sea Trees as a way to accelerate the development of blue carbon ecosystems. Because if there's one problem in the carbon policy that's still happening actually, but it's starting to be figured out, is that it's much easier to figure out how to solve things on land than it is in the ocean. Because we're land-based creatures. So the policies, the science, the governance issues, even the people doing the problems, it's far easier to work on land. So most of the solutions to climate change have been focused on land. Yet the ocean is the hero of the story. We have to accelerate that. So we launched Sea Trees as a way to actually accelerate development of blue carbon ecosystems. There's currently 10 projects around the world that we support to restore ecosystems. We have mangrove projects in Indonesia, Kenya, and Baja California. We have kelp restoration projects in California and Sydney, Australia. And then we have a coral reef restoration project in Indonesia, in Bali. We're currently looking at a number of other projects around the world, including the Caribbean, in Africa, and South America, elsewhere. And the idea is that we're trying to essentially have the surf community and the global community support these projects through planting sea trees. And our goal is to get to 100 projects by the end of this decade.
That's ambitious and it's extremely cool. And I remember the launch of Sea Trees in 2018. In fact, I think I was the moderator of the panel in which Michael announced that to the
You
world.
were indeed.
I gave my tongue-in-cheek introduction to you guys as dropping in on the surf industry and making them react. Now, you mentioned before the idea of ocean positive, and I think that this linked pretty well in with what you're talking about here and some of these really exciting projects. The kelp forests, I've seen some of the things you've been doing off the coast of California around Palo Verdes, the coral planting in Bali. Can you make the link for us between some of these super cool projects and, as well as some of the exposure you've had through, for example, the WSL's coverage of the World Championship Tour competition in Grajigan in East Java, and how that links to this idea of ocean positive and doing more than just offsetting, but actually going beyond and sequestering and pulling carbon, decarbonising the atmosphere?
Yeah. Well, again, it comes to story and narrative. So a lot of the story around climate change is super negative. Oh, the world's burning, drought, fire, flood. What am I going to do? I'm one person. Pretty negative. We actually think it should be a positive story of people coming together to enable the ocean to help solve the problem for us, to restore climate balance. So just literally the word itself is a reframing. There's other things that we do too. I hate the word offset. I think it's politically charged, and it's kind of like I have to pay penance for my sins. How much do I have to offset? What's the cost? Never use the word as a verb. It's more about taking responsibility for your climate impact. And as we're surfers, we like to say, wipe out your carbon footprint. So we had Greg Long, who's one of our ambassadors, who big wave surfer knows a thing or two about wipeouts. We helped him calculate his footprint for the year, chasing big waves, and then he wiped out his footprint through Sea Trees. And then there's this idea of ocean positive. So that's, as I said before, that if we somehow just stop all emissions, so offsets weren't needed, we actually just stop emitting altogether, it's still not enough to solve climate change anymore. We actually have to take responsibility for more than we actually emit. So the way Ocean Positive works is we have what we call a custom carbon offset product. It's called the Sea Trees token. We're actually working on putting that on blockchain right now. It's not on the chain yet, but it will be soon. And that combines 1 ton of high quality carbon offsets that have been verified on the Verra database. And then also we plant 4 mangrove trees and restore a square foot of kelp forest, which also take out about a ton of CO2 over the 25-year life of the trees. And that essentially helps you go negative, carbon negative or ocean positive. And we call that second piece the blue carbon investment piece, because like kelp forests aren't even part of the carbon markets yet. There's not enough science that can allow a carbon credit to be verified and issued for kelp carbon sequestration yet. But we can't wait. Like we don't have time to wait for that to happen. Like we actually need to accelerate that. So for brands and partners who know their footprint and then wipe that out with C-Trees tokens, that's how you become ocean positive. And then we have a whole branding and marketing story around that, because it doesn't just end there with the action of doing it. It's how do you tell that story to your customers and your stakeholders in a way that engages them to want to do the same thing. Like that's actually a key part of what our success has been based on is we understand the business perspective, we understand how they have to communicate to their customers and their employees and their stakeholders, and we're able to provide the language and narrative that's really effective, the media content, the stories that tell the story really well, so it's turnkey. It's actually very simple to do.
Right on. And it does make for very compelling content. How then? Let's take the issue, and I think we've done a good job of encapsulating what the issue is, what the sustainable surf approach to the problem, climate change is, and some of the programs, C-Trees, the idea of being ocean positive, going beyond bad word offsetting to the next stage of decarbonisation, which involves blue carbon, and some of it, as you mentioned, not verifiable yet, but there's always a chicken and egg problem with these new technologies, right? So let's get out ahead of that. How does this relate to the surf park industry? How do you think surf park visitors, in the future, many of these folks will perhaps never have been to an ocean, aren't particularly engaged with coastal or marine environments. How do we get them engaged in these issues and the solutions that you're suggesting?
I think anyone who goes to a surf park is going to care about the ocean. But it's hard for me to imagine. On the margin, sure, there's going to be people who just want to have a good time, but I think that the surf parks are selling this vision of what surf culture is. Surf culture is very appealing, even to people who don't live by the coast. In fact, we actually did a survey in the early days where a friend of ours who does market research was asking around the country at music festivals, what sport do you want to learn? And surfing was number one by far. And the further away the kids were from the coast, the higher that number was. There's an aspirational aspect to surfing that is really powerful. And that's why surf products sell so well, even in the middle of the coast where people don't surf, right? So that story of the ocean can never be fully removed from a surf park. It's always part of it. And you're in water, right? It may not be salty, but it's still water. And there's that connection to water that we have that's in our DNA. Like life evolved in the water. So I think that there's no way to really remove the desire to think about the ocean from a surf park. And then from there, how do you take care of it? Like also, I think other studies I've seen show that people may question whether you want to take care of land-based ecosystems, but the ocean, everyone thinks a healthy ocean is vital to the planet. And again, it is, right? So I think those aspects will mean that a surf park better have a good sustainability story. And if they do, it's actually quite an opportunity for them to generate even more engagement, more trust with their stakeholders and their visitors, and potentially more revenue as well.
I tend to agree with that, and I'll take the social scientist approach here to kind of add into what you're saying, where I think what makes surfing so appealing and how it can work with the surf parks to go beyond just a normal water park experience is to tap into the ancient indigenous roots of this activity. It's not just going down a water slide, it's a skills-based activity that was devised thousands of years ago. And if you learn to surf there's a connection between you and that history that makes the experience so much more meaningful than jumping in a tube and going down a water slide. And I my belief is that if surf parks can get people engaged with that, then it becomes so much more meaningful as an experience, as well as skills progression and the idea that there are professional surfers where there's not professional water slide riders. You can aspire to something. There's an Olympic sport based around it, but it also ties back to this ancient culture which is based in coastal and marine environments. And if you become a part of that, that is so much bigger than a visit to a water-based attraction. And I think that's where serious value is, kind of intangible value, but value for people who are visiting surf parks that will keep them coming back to those, and that can, I think, potentially plug them into a broader community of people who give a shit about coastal and marine environments and want to do something about it. Pretty fired up about the potential of surf parks to create whole new demographics of activists for these environments. So, do you have any thoughts on how surf parks can be leaders in educating people in new ways to find solutions to climate change through these methods of the ocean being the superhero? How do we get that into the experience?
Yeah, I think that the story actually can be made positive just from the very beginning. I was looking at some data from a surf park in Southern California where they compared their water usage versus a golf course in the same location. They use like 10% of the water of the golf course. Even though you might think a giant pond in the air, like in the desert, would evaporate like crazy, turns out millions of blades of grass evaporate a whole lot quicker than just a flat sheet of water. And they're trying to figure out how do they turn that story into a positive, not a negative. And it really does come down to having an authentic approach and a transparent approach. Like, I don't think anyone expects someone to be 100% sustainable with no impact. That's just not realistic. What they expect is someone who owns what they're doing and is transparent about what their impact is now and what they're doing to mitigate that. And if that mitigation, you can avoid the word mitigation altogether. It's about creating positive things for the environment that the visitors can see, and that actually makes a big difference. A good question is whether those impacts or those benefits need to be produced locally or globally. And because especially if it's a surf park in the middle of America, they're pretty far from an ocean-based ecosystem. Does it make sense to support an ocean-based ecosystem? And I think it actually does. It's certainly a combination of other things that are local. For one thing, the carbon footprint of a surf park, CO2 is a well mixed gas in the atmosphere. So any carbon that's emitted by the park or by the people traveling to it is pretty much mixed within a couple of weeks in the atmosphere. So there's a project somewhere else around the world that takes CO2 out and puts it in the ocean. That actually can be directly credited by the project itself. And then that project could generate stories that are part of the content that they tell their parks customers, part of the marketing content. And then the other question I think is really interesting, Jess, is how do you engage the customers in that same story? Like if I was going to get on my soapbox for a minute, and this is a good place to be on a soapbox, it's that individuals themselves are really lagging behind everyone else in solving climate change. There's this general narrative that the problem is caused by governments and corporations. Yet in the United States, 80% of the emissions from the country are controlled by US households. And it's mostly because everything that we buy has a footprint associated with it. And the end user is the one ultimately who owns that footprint. And so, the actual footprint for individuals is fairly low compared to a large park or, a factory or a company. But I think that if there's a way to engage the visitors to think about their own footprint, to learn about how actually solving it's a positive thing, that opens up communities that and values that are important to anyone who's getting exposed to this ocean narrative, right? This history of surfing could really generate incredible loyalty and engagement from for the park's customers.
I totally concur with that and the idea of the value add. And I could see potential for surf parks to, even formal links of sister surf breaks or ecosystems on the coast, yeah, and directly involving themselves in either conservation or blue carbon projects that could be a feature of what they show on site, and just get people excited about positive impacts that are happening.
Absolutely. One thing that we can do at Sea Trees is we can help find projects that are close to certain parks. We have a team that's ready to develop projects around the world. And quite often we know projects that are interesting, but we can't fund them until a large partner comes in to help us fund that project. So I would love to talk to any surf park who's interested in finding projects to make part of their sustainability portfolio. And I said our goal is to get to 100 projects by the end of the decade. I want to get to that sooner, actually. When we do that with partnerships. So one of the things we're really missing in this overall solution set is role models. Like, you know, humans, it's far easier to copy someone else doing something than it is to invent that something yourself, right? And when it comes to like carbon change, or climate change and carbon footprints, it's really hard to know what your impact is. Um, I could send someone to a carbon calculator. You can get your energy bills for 12 months, figure out how many miles your cars drive per year, how many flights you take, how many miles that is, and then you can calculate your footprint. And by that time, you're pretty much, watching Netflix instead because it's so boring. And anyone who actually gets that far, then there's a cost on top of it, right? But really, what it is, I could simply just take the average footprint of an individual in the U.S. It's 20 tons, or a house of a family is 50 tons, and just take immediate action. And then from there, we tell the story and all the solutions that are positive and engaging, like the community. Like, can we use surf parks as a way for ocean positive surfers to connect and gather? Right? It's really, like, even if you did go through the exercise of calculating your footprint and buying the offsets, um, no one tells you, quote, good job. Like, who would tell you that? You have no way to even find someone who cares. Yet I think surfers can actually be that community of people who really care. And through a surf park as a gathering spot, that may actually be a key way to have people really do it. Like, what if there was a exclusive day that only people who'd done their footprint for the year and wiped it out could surf at the park?
A discount for people who could prove that they'd wiped out their carbon footprint for the year. Yeah, I could see plenty of opportunities to integrate that into the storytelling and as well as the operations of a surf park that wanted to make that a central part of their operations.
I actually hope to have an interesting solution that involves blockchain, not about financial cryptocurrency, but blockchain that I can present
Hmm.
at the Surf Park Summit in October.
I would love that. We've talked about some macro level stuff here, but let's go full macro. What's the big picture? How big are we thinking? And what are you guys looking at to get there?
Surfers can actually be the leaders in solving climate change. Who else? I mean, are we just going to wait for someone else to figure it out? We don't have that time. And maybe I should explain just how urgent the situation is. Like I've laid out the pathway. I think that surfers can do it. Partly through what we're doing with Sea Trees and trying to engage all the different surf brands and surf parks and surfers to all think about their role in the problem. But here's the stakes. Like, let's talk about the stakes. So let me say a bold statement. The single greatest impact to the Earth that is going to happen since the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago is what humans are doing now by emitting CO2 at the rate that we do. It's bigger than the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. It's bigger than every mass extinction that's ever happened on the Earth. And here's the reason why. It's that the carbon emissions that we're doing literally disrupts the carbon cycle in a way that causes a mass extinction. So most mass extinctions on the Earth are caused by CO2 emissions, right? And that's because it slows ocean circulation. As the Earth warms rapidly, oceans stratify, ocean circulation stops. That means that oxygen no longer gets to the deep ocean. And in the deep ocean, there's purple sulfur bacteria. So it's the one type of life on Earth that's not carbon based. They're based on sulfur, which is similar to carbon. And their byproduct is hydrogen sulfide gas, which is a potent neurotoxin to anything that breathes oxygen, anything on the carbon cycle. And so when the largest emissions of CO2 occur, these purple sulfur bacteria have a way to flourish in the ocean to the point where hydrogen sulfide gas bubbles onto land and kills everything on land. So 250 million years ago, in the Great Dying, the big physics mass extinction of all time, that was basically the scenario that happened. The difference between then and now is that we're emitting CO2 1,000 times faster than that period. That then it was caused by a continental scale volcano that was covering Siberia and lava a mile deep. Right? And that took 1,000,000 years to emit enough CO2 to trigger that mass extinction. We're doing the same amount of CO2 in basically a tenth of the time, or less, right? 150 years. So how will the Earth respond to that? I can tell you it's not good. And as I said, like, it's a planetary emergency. It's not too late to roll it back, but it's not just a slow thing that we have to solve in our lifetime or that our kids have to solve. Like, it's hitting us in the face right now. And you just have to look at the news. Like, there's a major heat wave in Europe right now and fires everywhere. Here in California, in Southern California, we had the driest winter in history. Remember, it didn't rain. It rained one day between January and June this year, this winter. Right? And there were wildfires that were, basically Bob McKnight, who's one of our supporters and donors for a long time. He's the founder of Quicksilver. He sent me a photo from February. He was evacuated out of his house in Laguna Beach at 4 a.m. due to a sudden wildfire that occurred during what should have been the rainiest month of the year. Right? So all these things are happening now, and they're only going to accelerate unless we somehow dial it back. And frankly, we can do it. It's not that hard. There's this miracle technology called photosynthesis that takes CO2 and sunlight and makes food and oxygen. Right? And throughout the history of humanity, people have been incredibly good at making things grow. So what we need to do now is take this ancient wisdom that we have of helping the earth flourish and be stewards of the environment, blend that with modern science and technology in a way that doesn't lose the ancient wisdom, the principles behind it, and speed up the earth's healing mechanisms. And we can absolutely do that. I can give you a couple of really good examples. So there's something called the Ocean X Prize that Elon Musk created. It was there to fund like the best solution enabling ocean superpower. One of them, called the Climate Works Foundation, actually artificially enhances ocean circulation. Remember, that's the big problem. Like, that's the kill mechanism of CO2 emissions. What they do is they take pumps that are wave driven. So basically, imagine a very long tube that goes from the top of the ocean into a buoy, and then it goes down about 100 to a couple hundred meters. And then the action of waves on that buoy pumps water from down deep up to the surface and spreads it out. So that basically brings nutrients from down below that allows the phytoplankton that live at the surface to flourish and grow. And then when the phytoplankton grow, they provide food for everything else that lives in the ocean. And eventually they die, and when they die, they sink, and they take their carbon with them to the deep ocean. It's called the biological pump. And so this is a way to artificially enhance ocean circulation in a way where you actually have fish farms and aquaculture centered around these pump areas. So you actually produce food at the same time as you're solving climate change and restoring ocean circulation, right? There's other examples of taking the weathering of rocks. So over million-year timescales, the largest remover of CO2 is the weathering of rocks. And you can actually crush up all living rock, put it on a beach, and that will actually rapidly, permanently sequester CO2 in a very safe way. That's the same way that similar chemistry to how coral reefs are kept alive in aquariums, by crushing up limestone and putting that crushed up limestone in the power plant's emission fluid, like the smokestacks, to take the CO2 out and create alkaline water, which, if the power plants happen to be next to an ocean, could be put in the ocean to reverse ocean acidification. So it's like the science is not that complicated. There's the ideas of how these get done are pretty low tech, actually, but we need this mindset around why we need to do this, why it's a good idea, why it's actually safe and fits the values that we need, the story of how humans have to live in harmony with the earth. And frankly, who better to help tell that story than sort of
Indeed. Now, speaking of these low tech solutions, you talked about kelp forests before. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the potential of kelp regeneration to its historical ecological ranges and what that might mean for carbon sequestration through that mechanism.
I would love to talk about kelp, Jess. So I'm a SoCal surfer. I live in Los Angeles. I surf in Palos Verdes quite often, and Palos Verdes is one of the largest natural kelp forests in California, especially Southern California. However, in the last 20 or so years, Palos Verdes has lost roughly half of its kelp due to the impact of urchin barrens. And Northern California in the last 10 years lost 90% of its kelp cover due to the impact of climate change and urchin barrens.
What are urchin barrens? Sorry.
Yeah, so let's talk about kelp forests. So kelp forests have sea urchins in them. I think everybody knows what a sea urchin is. They're essentially a mobile mushroom. So in a land-based forest, mushrooms are the decomposers. They eat the dead plants and decaying matter and convert that to nutrients for the rest of the forest to thrive. Right? And so in the kelp forest, urchins play that role. They eat the dead kelp and dead algae and detritus, and they process it and make it more available to the other things that live in the forest. However, the problem is that if there's too many urchins, then they have to eat the live kelp too. They can't just sit on the dead kelp alone. And they start at the base of the kelp plant. So it's called the holdfast. They eat that first. Problem, as soon as you eat that, then the whole kelp floats away, and there's no more kelp left. And before long, there's literally no kelp plants left at all, except for the only thing left there is sea urchins. But because they're such an ancient organism, they have this ability to actually turn into a zombie, and they can live for 50 to 100 years on no food. So what happens is, instead of having this healthy kelp forest, there's just a few urchins per square meter hiding in the rocks, waiting for kelp to fall on them. You have hundreds of urchins per square meter covering all the rocks where the kelp used to be. And they just sit there waiting for any kelp to establish. As soon as it does, they munch it right away. And they don't go away because they can live so long without food. And nothing will eat them. Like none of the predators that typically eat urchins, so like sea otters, sheephead fish, lobsters, and a few other types of organisms will eat urchins, but they won't eat the ones in the barrens because there's nothing inside them. They're essentially zombies. They don't taste good because they're not worth the risk of the spine, so there's no payoff at the end. So these urchin barrens become basically stable. And the only way to take the urchin barrens out and bring back kelp is either a natural disease that can waste all the urchins in the area, which does occur from time to time, or you can have humans come in and basically clear the urchins directly. And so that could be either commercial urchin fishermen or recreational scuba divers who go out with hammers and smash all these zombie urchins. And that's been proven very effectively to bring back the kelp forest, like quite dramatically, in fact. Because the great thing about kelp is it grows so fast. So like in giant kelp, it can grow up to 2 feet per day. Like imagine that. It's the fastest growing organism on the planet. So if you can just clear the urchin barrens, the kelp can come back within a year. You've got a fully grown kelp forest. And within a few years, you have fully restored biodiversity to where the sword forest is indistinguishable from an original forest. And on our website, we actually have transit videos. So we're actually restoring in Palos Verdes with our partner, the Bay Foundation, one of the scientists who figured this out and do the work. And Seatrees funds them to restore the kelp forest. They go in and they're working in White Point, which is on the south side of Palos Verdes. They've done transects, starting with just urchin barrens, to about a year later, you can see the fully restored kelp forest. And it's quite a dramatic thing.
So who knew there was a zombie apocalypse happening out off the coast of Palos Verdes, and what we really need is some kind of well-armed band of survivors to go out and smash zombies.
How many surf breaks do you know that used to have kelp forests that no longer have them? Whenever I tell the story to a surfer, they're like, "Oh yeah, I remember when the kelp was like off my break at like Salt Creek or Carbon Reef. I wish it would come back because
I know,
I
it just takes
appreciate
the
it."
chop out of the water, right? Like
Exactly.
you can surf when it's onshore and you got glacier
So,
conditions.
so here's a model where the surf community can come and restore the kelp forest. So we're actually working on that. Hopefully, in a year or two, the policies. California is currently evolving its policy around kelp restoration rapidly, and hopefully within about a year or two, we'll actually be able to organize community groups to go out and restore the local kelp forests.
Zombie killers. Let's get them out there. Excellent. Well, Kevin, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we wrap here?
I'm really interested in blockchain right now. And there's like, let's just eliminate speculation on like making money with Bitcoin or whatever. Like that's not what it's interesting. That's sort of like that bubble has now burst. And blockchain technology doesn't harm the environment if it's done the right way. It's actually can really be beneficial and have very low energy usage. And so we're trying to figure out how you can use something like an NFT to help signify an action someone might take to help restore oceans and basically reverse climate change. And I think there's actually quite a lot of value in that approach. And it could be a really interesting partner with a surf park where people who would come in, they could show the NFT that showed they went ocean positive, could get a discount or maybe get access to a lounge area or have a certain surf session where only ocean positive people were in. So it's actually a really fascinating solution to help people feel like this action, which is very intangible. Like if someone donates to Sea Trees, they go out and restore ecosystems. Like you don't get to visit the ecosystem, you don't see it. There's nothing tangible. All you get is the email saying thank you for your donation. And we can take that one step further and actually organize our communities to engage. So you have actually a lot more social validation of those actions that you take. And that directly ties into the businesses that we work with as well. So that's what we're working on right now. I hope to have really good solutions to that to announce in the next few months.
Right on. Well, let's dig in there a little bit. I think for a lot of people, NFTs are something of a mystery and seem to be fairly ugly artwork selling for extraordinary amounts of money. But based on blockchain, which I can see the sense of because that kind of records every single step of something along its path. So is the point to take the blockchain to take information about carbon, bad word, offsetting, ocean positive, going beyond offsetting, understanding how much carbon sequestration someone has paid to have happen, and then take an indelible snapshot of that could be used to kind of flash up digitally as you enter somewhere for a discount because you've gone ahead and done that. Is that kind of what you're driving at?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like there's two things. One is the blockchain is like a trusted, transparent third-party validator of actions that are taken, right? Which is a problem for anything around climate change because it's really hard to see what the impacts are because it's a colorless, odorless, tasteless gas that is really hard to quantify unless you're a scientist. So blockchain actually enables better ways to tell that story of impact that are hard to deny because it's so transparent. Like transparency is always a challenge in that line of work. And then this NFT idea of something you can actually own, in your digital wallet. So you pull up your phone, flash your NFT, your Ocean Positive NFT, and that because an NFT is also can prove who the owner is in the NFT. It can't be faked. Proves that you've actually taken that action. It's not a gimmick. So I would think if a company is really engaged in solving their climate footprint, they want to connect with their customers who are also doing the same thing. This idea of an NFT is the perfect way to prove that, right? In a way that really is really hard to fake. So it's got a lot of power. So to me, that's the power of blockchain. I'm not interested in cryptocurrency and speculating in that. Like, I don't own any cryptocurrency. There is some value in it, sure, but in terms of like, it causes a lot of distraction to what I think the real power of blockchain is.
Yeah, for sure. We've had internal discussions about that for years at Stoke as well, in just being able to track through carbon offsets and actions and making sure that they're kind of not incinerated or part of an agroforestry project that's going to be harvested 20 years from now for whatever ends. So, well, thank you, Kevin. We'll call it a day and wrap right there. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and talking us through what you're up to and how it can integrate with the surf park industry to help, I think, improve the experience of surf park visitors, to plug them into a world bigger than themselves and be a part of the solution to the biggest problem facing the world today, as you tell it.
Thank you, Jess. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Right on, Kevin. Thanks, mate.